Bonsoir, Ni Hao, Que Paso. Welcome to Queer Abolition. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to show up to this important webinar. Again, welcome and thank you. My name is Ugani Tuza. I am a black bisexual man, and I am currently incarcerated in the Massachusetts State Prison, specifically MCI Norfolk State Prison. Today, you are going to hear some esteemed people speak on abolition, mostly within a queer perspective. Abolition being framework to eradicate the ideals, systems, and institutions of oppressive policing in the prison industrial complex. These esteemed people are well-educated, professionals in their fields, and they have experience in the abolitionist movement. We expect that at the conclusion of this event, that not only will you be enlightened, you also will be armed with enough abolitionist knowledge to go on to start making a real difference in society. With all that said, let's get down to business. Today I witnessed something that I unfortunately seen many times, yet despite its reoccurrence, it's still unsettling to me. A black transgender sister of mine, who was incarcerated here at Norfolk, was cleaning the showers in my housing unit with a power washing machine. Her job requires her to go from unit to unit to complete this task. Due to this prison being on quarantine lockdown, I haven't seen her in a while. So I went upstairs to see her and talk with her. In the midst of us talking, I turned and seen a few people looking at her with contempt. Their body language and facial expressions screamed hate. It screamed transphobia. Again, I've seen this many times. There's a system in place based on the ideals of homophobia and transphobia. This system occupies prisons and police departments, as well as other institutions. When we have prisons and police departments infested with policies, cultures, and promotion of anti-queer identity and expression, reform is not the all strategy to stop this madness. You have to get rid of these policies, cultures, and promotion. You have to get rid of the systematic homophobia and transphobia. That's what abolition means, to get rid of. Reforms to me is like an assist in a game of basketball. And abolition is the slam dunk. You don't get that slam dunk without the assist, yet the slam dunk score wins the game. So yes, we need reforms. But if it is not followed by abolition, then we will find ourselves 5, 10, or 15 years from now protesting and reforming the same issues of today. If domesticated slavery was never abolished in the United States, perhaps today there would still be slavery. Even then, the Confederate States were shouting, let's just make reforms. In conclusion, when we abolish the system of homophobia, transphobia, oppressive policing, and the prison industrial complex, we will immediately see true justice and true equality and true equal opportunity. We will immediately see a better America.
You have 1 minute left.
Thank you, and God bless.
Powerful words from Sugani, one of our inside members currently serving a life sentence because of the ways in which this callous system operates. And so if we could go through and maybe have each panelist introduce themselves and their powerful work, and maybe explain why you're an abolitionist. Who'd like to go first? You can just feel free to unmute yourself and take the floor.
I'll go. Hi. Hi, everybody. My name is Kenyon Farrow, and I'm currently the senior editor of thebody.com, which is a news and information website about HIV, for people living with HIV, for communities most vulnerable to HIV. We do a lot of work around, or reporting around sexual and reproductive health, drug user health, sex worker health, et cetera. And I'm an abolitionist because I have a longer history of doing a range of work around anti-criminalization work, including being a former staff member with Critical Resistance. And I think just abolition, when I came across Critical Resistance in the early 2000s, just made a lot of sense to me as somebody who had experienced, family members and loved ones who, were locked up as I was a kid, or even later in life, and just began to see the uselessness of prisons and the policing apparatus, and all the ways like the surveillance has come to define so much of our culture. So that's me, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go. Zahara Green. I am the co-founder and executive director of Trans City Barriers, a trans-led nonprofit organization that serves transgender and gender nonconforming people in the state of Georgia. I'm also the board president of Black and Pink, a prison abolitionist nonprofit organization that fights for the abolition and serving LGBTQIA and those living with HIV. I am an abolitionist because at 17, I found myself homeless. I found myself living in poverty. I found myself a Black trans woman living on the streets. I found myself incarcerated in a system and had to survive that system. I'm an abolitionist because I recognize what that system was. I recognize what that system is. I recognize that system is rooted in white supremacy. That system is rooted in violence. That system is rooted in holding back someone that is in a Black body, holding back someone that is in a trans body, holding back somebody that is living in poverty. It is a system that does nothing but harm, and that system needs to be abolished and should no longer exist.
Yes, Zahara, thank you. That was amazing. I'm Jason Lydon. I use he and him pronouns or anything else with respect if you're talking about me. What do I do? I'm the minister at the Second Unitarian Church here in Chicago. I also sit on the board of the Chicago Community Bond Fund, the Unitarian Universalist Prison Ministry of Illinois, and I get to be part of the advisory board for Critical Resistance, which is, their work has inspired me forever. And why I'm an abolitionist, I think certainly my experience of incarceration in 2003 was a huge part of shaping that, being in a system that was so dehumanizing, experiencing sexual violence at the hands of prison staff, and just recognizing and wrestling with the reality of the ways in which anti-human existence, and specifically anti-blackness, was happening within the system, constantly destroying the ways in which people were trying to survive inside an incarceration system. And so people, whether it was in a county jail in Georgia, a federal prison in Atlanta, or a federal prison in Massachusetts, all of them were places and sites where people were experiencing torture, while others on staff were saying that they were keeping us safe and that they were keeping other people safe. And that distortion of safety had such a huge impact on my beginning of becoming an abolitionist. And then I would say certainly my faith, my understanding of universalism, is that if we are to recognize that there is no hell after life, then we have the responsibility of abolishing all of the hells that exist during life as well. And so prisons and policing systems are manifestations of hell, and so it is my responsibility as a person of faith to abolish them.
Andrea or Dean?
This is such not a group of shy people. I'm not sure what's happening right now. Like, this is not usually when we're hanging out together how things go. But anyway, I'm Andrea. I go by she. I'm fine with any pronoun. I'm a Black woman, a lesbian, an immigrant to the US. My mother is an immigrant to Canada from Jamaica, so I'm first gen there. And I say those things both because they're not necessarily immediately apparent from looking at me, but also because they really shape my work. And which has focused primarily on policing criminalization, mass incarceration, detention, and deportation of women and LGBTQ people for the past many decades. I won't tell you how many. For me, that's what brought me to abolition. I mean, I think my own experience of not being protected, my mother's experience of never being protected by the state and finding protection in family and community, my grandmother's experience of experiencing violence from the state, not protection, and looking at how Black women and queer and trans and gender nonconforming people experience policing has been what's led me. I think once we look at policing through those experiences, we get much more quickly to abolition. And then the people on this panel taught me to be abolitionists. And so I've learned so much from every single person on this panel and continue to every day. So I'm really grateful for everyone here.
I'm Dean Spade. I'm sorry about the dog barking background noise that might be happening. I'm outdoors and, you know, it's complicated. I live in Seattle on Duwamish land, and for like the last 20 years or so, I've been part of various kinds of queer and trans movements trying to really lift up racial and economic justice as the center of what queer and trans politics is and should be, but isn't always. And especially during my lifetime, there's been a lot of like pro-military, pro-police, queer and trans or gay and lesbian type of stuff happening. And so that's been a lot of my work. Is on the local level these days, I'm part of a campaign to stop the state of Washington from building a new women's prison. And I'm part of a campaign to shut down the detention center that's owned by GeoCorp in our region, and other campaigns to defund the police and other local stuff. Why I'm an abolitionist kind of relates, I think, to what Sugani was saying. So sorry about my dog. He really is adorable. That like in my lifetime, when there's been uprisings against policing and exposure of the violence and horribleness of prisons, we've seen a lot of reform, but we haven't actually seen things get better for our people. We haven't seen less people locked up. We haven't seen less police in our communities. We've actually seen more and more and more money to the police and prisons and more growth and more facilities. And then whenever we say there's a problem, what they offer us is like more of that. And so to abolition, it, for me, is like, it tells what our end goal is, so we can actually measure, is this a step we want to take? So to me, abolition is the most pragmatic politics for dealing with what the police and prison system are. Even though we're told that we're like pie in the sky and dreaming of something unreal, actually it's incredibly pragmatic. It's like, wait, is this 2 steps forward or 2 steps back? And that's why abolition is central to me. And I also feel it's a collective, collaborative, ongoing learning process of making a new world in which we don't rely on police or prisons for ideas of safety or care, which is so obviously what we need to not do, but it's pretty deep in there. So it feels like it's also this really creative community building process of saying, what does make us safe? What does make us well? And let's do that together. And that's actually, those are big, hard questions because there's a lot of harm in our society. So abolition is also this like practice, community practice for me.
Wow. So clearly we have all the right people, or a lot of the right people here on this call. Thank you again for all of your time. So our first question is, in what ways are LGBT people and those living with HIV, especially Black, brown, and poor folks, targeted or impacted by the system? Could you offer us some high-level analysis and or personal stories from your work to really bring this out for the audience? So again, in what ways are LGBT and people living with HIV, BIPOC folks targeted or impacted by the system? And whoever wants to take the floor can go for it.
I vote Andrea first.
Wow, because I'm just going to repeat things I learned from all of you again. But, you know, I think that we see one sort of structural exclusion at every level in terms of economic and community social exclusion produces high levels of poverty in LGBTQ communities, particularly BIPOC communities, experiencing particularly Black lesbians and trans women experiencing the highest rates of poverty and structural exclusion in this country alongside Native LGBT people, and that produces increased contact with law enforcement through criminalization of poverty, criminalization of survival, criminalization of coping mechanisms, and criminalization of self-defense in terms of when we are experiencing violence in our communities and we don't have any protection from police, defend ourselves, and then are immediately criminalized for that. So I think the other thing I want to say about policing is that we know that it's set up to create to reinforce racial relations of power, to reinforce relations of power based on nation states, that to reinforce relations of power based on class, to repress workers. We don't often know that police were also created to enforce lines of gender, and that the first police forces were very much charged with keeping public spaces clear of any signs of gender nonconformity, of sexual nonconformity, and of disability or being disabled by an ableist society. And so the idea was to sweep up people who in any way disrupted the quote unquote public order in that way. And of course, that included Black and brown people. And when combined with sexual and gender nonconformity or being disabled, contributed to just routine police contact for just being present in public spaces. And I think we see that now. I've heard people say, yeah, we used to be arrested for cross-dressing. Now we're arrested for loitering for purposes of prostitution or disorderly conduct or riding the train. Or, I mean, there's just so many ways in which Black, queer, and trans and gender nonconforming people's mere presence in public can literally lead to an officer walking up to them and writing them a ticket for disorderly conduct on the grounds that their mere presence is disorderly, and then escalating that from there. So those are some of the ways that people come into contact with the system. And then there's what happens afterwards that manifests all the structural violence that we've been talking about that leads us to a path to abolition. I'm gonna pass it to Dean. Ha.
Yeah, I want to back that and just say, like, the kinds of vulnerability produced by like a profit-driven society are so intense, and the whole system of criminalization is just this like completely illegitimate thing that has nothing to do with like who's dangerous and who's not. It has to do with just like launching this, you know, military power, this force on vulnerable communities. And we just know who's left out of like the systems of jobs, and who's pushed out of families, and who's got these long genealogies of being considered like dirty or backward or undeserving, and the ways that lands on people who are considered like disgusting in our society for being queer and trans and gender nonconforming, all those pieces, and how, I mean, as Andrea said so well, like all the ways that that's more and more and more intense if you're also BIPOC, disabled, undocumented, you know, all the pieces that go in. And so I think we all see that. I mean, in my own work as an attorney, just seeing like with young people, like who gets pushed out of school, and then like, you know, their parents are also pushing them out for being gender nonconforming or trans, and then you can't get into the domestic violence shelter because they don't let in trans women, and then, you know, or you're in the juvenile detention center, the you know, some version of the juvie jail or prison, and they're like actually writing you up because you're trying to go by the name you go by, and they're saying that's a violation, and growing your nails is a violation, and your actual being is a violation, and it's all a discretionary system because you're going to spend more time there then, right? Or people who I've tried to help get into an alternative to incarceration, like into drug treatment, and they're like, oh, we don't take trans people because we don't know where to put them in this system. And that's happening in a state where there's a law that says you can't discriminate against trans people in public accommodations, and you call the state's attorney people and they're like, oh yeah, but that's just what the contract says, sorry. Like just for me, it's both all the ways people are given kind of no way out of the system once it touches them, and all the reasons it touches them more, and then also all the ways that the supposed protections for queer and trans people that have been put in place in our lifetimes are lies. Like, I mean, they're lies for everybody. We know that like racism has been illegal in the United States for half a century, and it's alive and well, and actually in many ways, like the racial wealth divide is worsening. The criminal punishment and border enforcement systems are always expanding. So I partly say that because one of the things on my mind with this question is that new Supreme Court case that says you can't discriminate against LGBT people in employment. And people celebrated that so intensely as this big victory. And I'm just like, everybody knows that stuff doesn't work, right? Like, I mean, just I just feel like there's a kind of a realism we need. That's part of also why I'm an abolitionist, of just like, oh, right, these legal systems were not designed to protect hated groups. In the last half century, they've changed their story. So they say, oh yeah, we're here to protect people from racism and ableism, and oh, now from homophobia and transphobia. But the outcomes are relentless: criminalization, poverty, marginalization, deportation for queer and trans people. So I think that's a piece of this story for me, is busting the myth of an equal legal system, or of any kind of relief being available to people there, even though of course it should be, but it's not, right? So there's that kind of, what do we do once we realize that system is going to keep failing us? And that, to me, the answer to that is like an abolitionist strategy. Yeah. And I'm going to nominate Kenyon.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would say, and if I missed this, I'm sorry if it was already said, but I just, to add a piece here about kind of, you know, family systems, and think a lot about foster care, and you know, which is disproportionately Black and brown young people are taken from their homes for, you know, a range of situations. But then you layer on homophobia and transphobia onto that. So you have a lot of young people who can't get placed in homes, or are sometimes sent back to the foster care agencies once they begin to present as queer or gender nonconforming, you know, individuals. And so then those folks have aged, you know, into foster care, more likely to have gone through kind of sexual abuse and trauma in those situations. And then, you know, are just kind of released, you know, at 18 with, you know, very little resources or whatever. And so it's one of the things that drives the kind of rate of queer and trans youth homelessness so high, which then sets people up to be in situations through which they are going to interact with policing agencies, kind of first and foremost. But also I'll talk also about kind of the HIV piece of this question. So, I mean, first and foremost, and we're seeing it obviously in the COVID-19 pandemic, the ways in which, you know, race and class and regionalism not only just disproportionately stratifies who contracts the virus and who gets sick and who dies, but then also who becomes a kind of target of a moral panic around, you know, disease transmission, right? And certainly, you know, HIV is kind of the biggest kind of paradigm for that. So, you know, here in the United States, you know, we often think about the kind of criminalization of HIV, you know, starting in the 1980s as, you know, just states started to add laws onto their books that specifically criminalized people who were living with HIV, to targeting them if they didn't disclose that they were HIV positive with a romantic or sexual partner, to some states that didn't criminalize transmission of the virus, you know, et cetera. So, but also within that, I think people sometimes forget that actually as early as 1982, so we're talking a year after the gay cancer, or the sort of notion that something was happening, right? We eventually learned it was an infectious disease. But as early as 1982, the Reagan administration, which had already had a policy of keeping Haitians out of the country, once they realized that there were a number of Haitian men who were locked up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in 82, decided to bar Haitians from entering the country writ large, based on, before we even called it human immunodeficiency virus, right? Before HIV was even the frame. So that had happened that early on. I'll put a piece in the Slack that I co-wrote with a friend about that history. But then you have, you know, going into certainly the 80s, 90s, and even currently, where, you know, people are targeted for, you know, non-disclosure of HIV status in many states. There's a lot of activism to sort of transform, you know, those laws that exist in different states. But when you kind of also barrel down and look at who is typically charged in those cases, it's primarily gay men and either cis or trans women, often who are sex workers, right? And the Williams Institute has done some reports around this. And so we see the ways in which, like, it's not just about the HIV diagnosis, but like the specific body of person who becomes representative of a kind of moral panic around, you know, I just saw a story today in, you know, on my Google alerts from HIV, and it's almost every week there's at least one case that pops up in my Google alerts about some person in a place that is knowingly spreading HIV to, you know, the populace there, right? And is often how it's framed. Even once and then when you get to the court case, it's often not, what the media normally reports. So I just would put that into space in terms of thinking about how, HIV also becomes a criminalized status in the United States, but specifically, targets primarily men of color who are gay or bisexual identified, as well as trans and cis women, but often whom are also sex workers who, once found out HIV positive, get charged with the non-disclosure status as well. I'll pass it to Zahara.
For me, what I think about what is it rooted in, and what I think of is white supremacy and capitalism. I think of how the system, with the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States, and how within that amendment it still exists where slavery can still continue on for those that are confined in penal institutions in our nation. And for me, I see that being in existence, and I've actually seen it with my own eyes, understanding how in Blanchard, Georgia, I was at a probation detention center, and this was a place where you had to work a work detail, or you were faced with violence from the staff. And this is somewhere where you see the exploitation of labor through the use of violence in this system. And to me, that's slavery still in existence today, and it's in a covert way, and it's hidden through many laws, and a lot of the people who live in our society are not aware of it. And I see it rooted in white supremacy, and also I see it rooted in capitalism, how the property penal codes exist within our society that protects property from individuals who are having to survive. I mean, people who are not having the same opportunities that other people within our society has. And this system is a system of inequality, is a system of inequity. It is a system that is rooted through all the same things that exist. Capitalism is rooted through white supremacy as well. And I see that there's a protection for property, and you're pushing individuals to their survival instinct of surviving, and that's a human instinct to happen. And for me, that's what I see that's happening within the laws that exist with the targeting of Black and brown LGBT queer people.
Thanks, Zahara. I like getting to go after you. I appreciate your brilliance. I think one of the pieces for me that I remember kind of being part of was the creation of zero tolerance anti-bullying policies in schools. That as a young white cis gay boy in a suburban town in Massachusetts was experiencing a lot of harassment and violence, and then thought, was my experience of harm was in many ways co-opted by liberal gay rights folks, particularly white gay rights folks, who were pushing these anti-bullying laws that ended up pushing out so many LGBT youth of color, particularly Black young lesbian girls and gender non-conforming folks, with these rules and laws and policies that kick people out of schools and force, this increased youth homelessness, young people just not having access to schools, as if schools aren't their own carceral system. That's another part of this conversation at some point, I'm sure. But that the idea was some queer folks are getting protected, and some being white queer folks are getting protected constantly at the expense of Black and brown queer folks. And I feel like that's one of the big pieces around how, for me, when working in white LGBTQ communities, talking about the ways in which solidarity around queerness needs to be a multiracial, Black-led, Indigenous-led, people of color-led effort that white folks are figuring out ways of supporting, and figuring out that queer solidarity and queer liberation means Black liberation, means an end to settler colonialism, means abolition, right? Because there's no way in which queer liberation exists without all of those things together. And I think one of the pieces around what's driving people into this system, in addition to the pieces of white supremacy, these systems of white supremacy and capitalism and settler colonialism, is going back to one of the things Andrea was saying, is just the criminalization of sex in general, and the ways in which queer bodies and queer sex is constantly criminalized, whether that's queer in the sense of same-sex sexual acts, but also queer sex includes sex for money, right? The ways in which we think about queerness as ways of breaking down kind of these borders that get put around life and identity and sex and gender. And the resistance to that, as exactly Andrea was saying around gender, like if you were wearing whatever it was, more than 3 pieces, or if you weren't wearing 3 pieces of clothes of the appropriate gendered clothing that you were assigned at birth, that leads to incarceration at different points, right? And then as that shifts and changes, we are still today seeing so many LGBT folks, particularly gay men, being affected by the sex offender registry system. And so there's ways in which we need to have conversations about the criminalization of sex, the internal shame that exists within so many queer folks who growing up in a queer antagonistic society, and people acting out in ways that are inappropriate and harmful and cause pain and suffering to other people. And how are we doing the healing work for queer folks to dismantle the shame that is created within so many people, and the response to that shame is inappropriate and harmful sexual behavior at times. Obviously not everybody by any means is behaving in that way, but we can see these correlations. But then regardless of the correlation, we also see that the policing of queer sex leads to this kind of increased presence of queer folks on the sex offender registry, whether that's people engaging in consensual sexual relationships, in intergenerational relationships. The story not that long ago out of Florida of the young girl who was having a sexual relationship with another young girl, like they were 18 and 16 or something like that. And the homophobic parents use the criminalization of queer sex to prosecute and pursue their own kind of homophobic ideas of what should be healthy and appropriate relationships, that then gets to see our community so disproportionately represented on the registry, which then homophobes use it to say, look at all those dangerous, bad, terrible, pedophile queer people. And the system has fed that and helped create that. Like our criminal legal system perpetuates this myth of the sexually abusive, sexually harmful queer person, which then also makes it hard for us to then be able to have real conversations about the ways in which particularly gay men have the need to do some very important and hard work around dismantling shame and inappropriate sexual behavior that has been created through this anti-queer culture that we live in. And it's harder to have those conversations and maybe shouldn't even have them in a live virtual forum at this moment like this. But I think it's an important part of us saying, if we believe in abolition, we do want to hold each other accountable for harm, but our criminal legal system can't do that in the way that it is functioning and existing today. And so if we believe that we have the capacity to do something different, we know that our communities are being pushed into the system, then part of our resistance also includes loving collective holding of each other and holding each other accountable.
Wow, that was super powerful. And I'd like to actually stay there if we could, because here in the Boston chapter of Black and Pink, approximately half of our members who are on the inside are at the Massachusetts Treatment Center, who have either been accused of, convicted of a sex offense, or are also civilly committed. One of the other big things that we hear in the chapter are issues around the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was born out of this reformist kind of idea. And it really has caused more harm than good for a lot of incarcerated people, at least here in Massachusetts. So we hear about our members getting locked up because their legs touched, While I was incarcerated, I was locked in solitary confinement multiple times over PREA, as simple as receiving a hug from somebody. And a lot of our free world members also engage in sex work. So sex in so many ways informs our work here in the Boston chapter. And I wanted to put it back out to other members of the panel if they'd like to expand on any of the things that Jason touched on or some of the things we're experiencing here in our chapter.
I just want to say one thing about what Jason was saying and also what you just said. It's just one of the mythologies of the prison industrial complex and the policing system is that most harm happens between strangers. And then our experience in our lives and what all the research shows is that mostly we harm people we know and we get harmed by people we know. Like most often it's like, whether it's like in the family is like a huge amount of violence, including sexual violence, of course, and school, friends, teachers, coaches, people we work with. And so it really changes how you imagine solving the problems of sexual violence in our society. If instead of like I once saw somebody give a paper and they said that on TV, 90% of rape happens outside. But in real life, of course, way more than 90% happens close to home with people you know, or in a place you were in with people in your social circle or work circle or whatever it is. And so just totally changes how we would imagine solving those problems. And it wouldn't be a standing army of cops and a bunch of cages. And we can really see that. I'm thinking right now of the work of Generation 5 on the idea of, you know, their mission as an organization is to end child sexual abuse in 5 generations. And they have this useful document called Toward Transformative Justice. It's like a toolkit. And one of the things they talk about is like, during you know my lifetime in the last 40 years, there's been a really big increase in kind of a panic around child sexual abuse and a lot of more criminal laws around it. But most people don't report. So, you know, there's so many dynamics. You couldn't lock up all people doing that because it's happening in like everyone's family, it looks like to me. Like it's happening everywhere, you know? And so you need a different solution. You need a solution that's like, what are the root causes of this? Why is this happening? Why is this so common? What are the society's beliefs about sexuality and gender? What are the society's beliefs about children? What are the kinds of stressors and traumas that are never addressed? What kinds of support are people missing where they could get to work through their experiences? You know, one thing they mentioned in there is that in the US, if you're having thoughts or thinking about doing something bad to other people, you can't tell someone because then you'll be locked up. So that's going to prevent people from getting help to not do certain behaviors. So this relates to Jason's point about the shame surrounding all of us, and also the mythology that there's these bad monsters out there and we're going to catch them and lock them up and then we'll all be safe. That means that no one wants to say, oh, my family member is that monster. I'm that like it's just, once you create the idea of a monster, you can't solve the problem, right? And you know, people who are civilly committed, that's the whole basis of that story, is the idea that somebody can never be back with us, as opposed to saying, wow, this is all of our problem. We're all part of the systems that are the root causes of this. Which means we might all know something about what would make people safer, like what would make kids safer, what would make all people safer from violence. And we might be able to like have a really different approach to pragmatic solutions. Like if everybody had access to free housing, then a lot of people could get out of a lot of bad situations. But if you don't, and if you're going to lose everything, your healthcare or your whatever you need, or if like we didn't live in such an ableist society where people have to rely on their families for care, and so they have to stay in these abusive situations, you know, so there's just a lot of like not solutions oriented notions that hold up the prison industrial complex that are part of the sex phobia and the like moralism around sex, so that we don't solve like the really painful, very serious problems of violence that we're all like rightfully upset about. Instead, we get like misdirected towards like basically like revenge fantasies, I think.
I just want to add to that how much police are perpetrators of sexual violence and prisons are perpetrators of sexual violence and sites of sexual violence. So we're actually trusting the solution to the problem to a group of people who have higher rates of sexual violence than any other group, who on average, according to one study, are caught in an act of sexual violence every 5 days over a 10-year period the study looked at. And, you know, that's just the ones who are caught. And we know that 2/3 of people who experience sexual violence don't report it. Certainly that percentage is higher among people who are experiencing sexual violence from the people they're supposed to report it to. And so I want to highlight the fact that queer folks experience particularly high rates of sexual violence by police, whether we're lesbians who cops are saying, you know, I'll show you a different way, let me show you a different way, or show me what you do with, you know, your partner, or just are having a whole other sort of homophobic, lesbophobic, corrective rape fantasy. You know, there was an officer in Atlanta once who literally said, I'm doing this so the world will have one less dyke in it, you know, and that's just one of many stories I could tell, which I probably should have given a content warning for before I said that. But, and then there's gay men who also experience sexual violence by police, which I think is a group that we don't talk about that experience enough. And then trans women report consistently the highest rates of sexual violence by law enforcement. At least a quarter of trans women of color, particularly in New York, in LA, in other places, report rates of sexual violence by law enforcement, and in some places it's much higher. And so that's one thing. And secondly, I just want to point out that, yeah, the things that we do ostensibly to protect or stop that just end up isolating survivors from what they need. And Priya is a prime example. I've represented someone who was incarcerated in New York State prisons who experienced sexual assault by guards multiple times. And each time my client was the one who was thrown in solitary after being sexually assaulted for months without being able to access counselors or their lawyer or me, frankly. And to the extent that they then found ways to do other things to soothe themselves, were criminalized further and isolated further for that. And so I think that those two spectrums, like the police are perpetrating sexual violence and sexual violence is happening inside prisons, and then there's more violations of survivors in the context of the so-called response. For me, it's just a whole other reason why abolition is the only answer.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think, you know, so I just, what Andrew just said, I often think that we don't actually talk enough about, so here in New York, you know, before the current moment of uprising, there's just been probably a good, you know, decade or two of work around, you know, stop and frisk laws, which we, you know, that was kind of like the discussion, you know, a few years ago, and ending stop and frisk. And I often think we don't actually talk enough about the kinds of sexual violations for Black and brown men that happen, whatever their sexual orientation is in those interactions with cops, that that kind of just like physical groping and touch and pat downs, and often things are said in those interactions that are intended to sexually humiliate men. And so I just think, like, I am often big about, like, I don't think that we as a society really talk about the kind of sexual vulnerability of particularly Black and brown men through that as sort of one side of. And the second thing is, you know, over the last couple of years, I've just been thinking a lot about how there's kind of an assumption that in 2003, when the Supreme Court made the decision around Lawrence v. Texas, which was supposed to be the decision that basically said that the state could not, you know, kind of criminalize people, in this case, two gay men who I think their whole story is really interesting as a way to think about a lot of this. But the fact that I think there were two gay men, one older, one younger, one Black, one white. And, you know, so I just think, like, the kind of like fears of interracial sex, even within the context of a queer relationship, the accusation that there were drugs involved, you know, all kind of fueled that moment where the police felt like they could kind of enter this apartment. Both of those men died young, right? Like, they both are dead, right? Within 10 years, because they both were poor and had various struggles with addiction and a range of things, you know, over that time. So I think, you know, I think a lot about the two of them in that case, and also the ways in which, like, nothing really changed after that, right? So so somehow we're supposed to believe that, like, okay, so Lawrence v. Texas made it illegal to discriminate against or to criminalize, you know, gay sex, you know, quote unquote, and yet we still have police raid bars, back rooms get closed, you know, commercial sex venues get targeted, all, you know, these kind, which is how a lot of gay men end up on these sex offender registries to begin with. And so like I just think the movement has also lost an analysis and even any strategies in terms of thinking about that whole apparatus as it pertains to making actually gay men vulnerable in those scenarios. And that Lawrence v. Texas didn't actually change it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I've had a pretty interesting relationship with Priya. I myself been a trans woman who was housed in a male's facility. I was sexually abused by multiple individuals who were in there. And for me, in the beginning, I saw Priya as something as a remedy to be used to somewhat protect me. But over time, I've come to a better understanding of Priya and what it actually do, the practical part of it. Understanding Priya in many ways allows many loopholes for the institutions, and also Priya is something where there's no foundation of truly protecting individuals who are vulnerable to sexual abuse while in confinement. So for me, Priya is a pseudo policy, as my friend likes to say, there's like throwing a bone. It's like throwing you a bone. Like, here's the next thing, we're gonna do, but it's not really fixing or addressing the issue in the first place. So thinking of how the system is currently set up is like, who's responsible? How we shifting responsibility within using a system to supposedly protect individuals when it's not doing that whatsoever. And it's something that is used to target those who are LGBT queer people, while thereby attaching predator labels and different labels on individuals that follows them through every institution that they go through. And from my experience in these institutions, the officers often target those who are queer. I was targeted many times by officers. We were mistreated when we were in specific housing units that house LGBT people and queer people in those housing units. So it's more of a system it's more of something that's been used to target those who are queer rather than protect those who are queer. And also, I think of if you want to give protections through legal remedies, you should start changing things such as qualified immunity and sovereign immunity, and allow people to be able to hold those accountable who are in power.
Wow, powerful. So one part of abolition is building power to dismantle systems that cause harm. And that's the part that most of us focus on. But there's another part that's less focused on, or at least in the mainstream conversations. And that's about building love in community. And so I was wondering if y'all could talk about that side of the work.
I want to jump in mostly because I am late a little bit and still resistant to that at times a little bit, which is funny because church, like religious community in many ways, I feel like that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is create these spaces where we engage in that together. And I feel so attached and really stuck on, yes, we need to create things and alternatives. And in terms of policing, yes, I want us to create new ways of dealing with harm. And I just want to get rid of a lot of things. Like, some of the alternative to police is nothing. Some of it is, the way in which they criminalize people on the street is let people be, leave them alone. There's the piece around, yes, we need to create housing and communities of support. Absolutely. And some of our alternatives is really to just stop criminalizing queer life, brown life, black life, indigenous people, and to take away. We have so many laws. We're all committing misdemeanors probably right now, right? And so some of what is needed, I feel like, is yes, I'm thrilled and excited, and I know it's Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, I think, is one who particularly is always saying that abolition is a creative process, not just a destructive process. And I'm call me out on my toxic masculinity. I'm like, and I want to take things down and go away. Yes, let's create stuff too. And I also have, I have so much faith in humanity, I guess, weirdly enough, And I have so much belief that we have the capacity to create so many beautiful things, because we do all the time. As much as we have all these horrible things that we are talking about, these systems of violence and oppression, at every single moment that these things have existed, people have also planted gardens and created spaces of life and vitality. People have created music and art. One of the things I really appreciated listening to Rachel Herzing talk on one of these virtual things, because everyone is doing what we're doing right now, was that, in the US, we have not nearly enough cultural creativity and creation as part of our resistance. And I really appreciated that. So I'm contradicting myself and saying I'm resistant to it. But I think what excites me the most about some of the things that we are creating is the ways in which we can create communities of resistance, communities of solidarity and care. For me, coming out of a religious tradition that has both been part of creating these systems of harm and violence and resisting it, it's one of the places that I get excited about seeing, okay, so in my congregation, we can create safety policies that figure out how we address harm within a community of 225 people or so, to say, okay, if harm happens, what are the things we're going to do? Because it is our people. If you are people within our community and you're harming our people, what are the processes that we're going to enact so that we are keeping each other safe, so that we are holding people accountable when they cause harm? In Unitarian Universalism, we say that we have covenants. We're a covenantal religion in the sense that we make promises to each other. And so part of the promise at my church is that we say that we promise to engage in conflict and to embrace conflict, right? To say that conflict isn't something we're trying to run away from. It's actually something we want to lean into. And I think figuring out ways that we collectively can engage in conflict, I think that is one of the things that's going to help us deal with some of the kind of anger and frustration and stress in community that comes up, that turns into harm and violence in all sorts of different ways. And so if we start addressing conflict and interrupt gossip and whatever, all those types of things from the get-go, I think we can create cultures and communities where people are doing some of that work together. And then we figure out, okay, well, this community is doing that. And then this community over here is also trying that out. And so let's figure out how we relate to each other, and, constantly figuring out ways of expanding the connection of networks of people to relate with one another and share resources and all of that, to imagine how we can do things differently. Yet I still keep coming back to, yes, let's create all the things. And right now there's just the state is perpetrating so much violence all of the time that I feel really stuck. I'm aware that I feel stuck at times in saying, yes, I want to create things, and it's so hard to be creating stuff over here when I feel like I'm constantly fighting to stop these systems of anti-blackness and systems of policing that are just constantly getting in the way of us trying to create things. Because when people do create things, right, there are all these examples throughout history of people creating these autonomous communities or interrelated communities, and then the police come in and destroy them and attack them. And even online communities where sex workers share information about Johns who are causing harm, then the federal government comes in with SESTA and FOSTA and shuts them down, right? So when we are creating alternatives, the state is constantly trying to remove them from us. And so I feel in a struggle about it. So you all got to witness my struggle right here as I went through it. Zahara, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's important to, when we talk about dismantling and abolishing systems, what are we doing to replace these systems of harm and violence? And it's important to ensure that we're replacing systems with systems of love. How are we understanding how those who are inflicting violence, how are we doing the work? And is it through the lens of transformational justice, restorative justice, and not through this system of retribution that currently exists within our society, that's something that has to change, and we need to be using something that's built on love. And
yeah, I'll jump in. I have a thought about that. I think so. For me, in a lot of this, conversations going to something Jason just talked about too, about with all the sort of rhetoric about defunding the police and what that looks like, right, and what that is. I think so. It's both, that getting rid of police and prisons, but it's also for me thinking about the other systems that we have developed that, but for the kinds of surveillance and kind of punitive measures, if you don't do, X, Y, Z, or if you do X, Y, Z, you get cut out of, right? So I think about, things like, whether it's Medicare for all or universal health care, or, food stamps, or, welfare benefits, things that are about like, supporting people's lives that people can get access to, without, if you were convicted of a drug conviction, then you can't get, or you can't vote if you get convicted. It's like removing all of those things and then replacing them with, things that are about kind of care for people and supporting people's actual needs, I think is a good piece of it. So to me, I've been thinking a lot about this in the last couple of weeks for reasons that may become apparent in a few weeks that I can't really discuss. But I will say this, that I've been thinking a lot about the kind of, safety net and the kind of social contract as we think about, stuff like the New Deal and Medicaid getting created and these sorts of things, all of which have a range of problems, but are there. And so I think as much as we think about the sort of defund and dismantle piece of police, prisons, and like the sort of surveillance state, I'm also thinking about, and also what systems we build out of that. But I'm also thinking about not just like the what we think about in terms of the social contract, in terms of like the state's relationship to us, but also thinking about what is our social contract to each other, right? So in a lot of what's happened in the last few days, folks really pushing around the recent, murders of Black trans women in various cities over the last, week or two or whatever, to me is part of that. It is a part of that process about like actually saying what is our social contract, if you want to kind of use that framework, to each other, where it's not just about what sort of institutions we're dismantling or are giving people kind of access to. And so I think we have to kind of move both of those conversations at the same time to be able to then begin to shift how we think about transformative change, which, yeah, and I'm like a policy person, I'm a systems person, that's like my shit and whatever. But I am growing to become more interested in like what are real kind of organizing strategies to get groups of people to make agreements about how we like support and live in community with each other, across a range of different differences through which violence doesn't become, or targeting of various kinds has become, the sort of de facto way where, so it's in a sense, the idea like getting rid of the police in your head, right? The cop in your head, right? Or the prison in your head or your house or whatever it is. But I think we need to start moving both kind of strategies together.
I want to pick up also on this thing that Jason was talking about, because I have my own version of that same feeling that you're talking about, Jason, which is like, the way this has come up for me is like when we were trying to get the county I live in not to build a new youth jail, there was almost like this, we both have really big, kind of resistance to it. And the county even passed a law saying that they declare, a resolution for zero youth detention, and the city passed such a thing, but they still built a jail, right? They built this huge youth jail. And there was almost this story like, unless you can come up with a detailed plan that will resolve all violence, we're going to build the jail. Like, and I'm seeing this rehash now during this defund moment that Kenyon's referring to, where people are like, we can only defund the police if there is a laid out plan that will prevent and address all forms of violence. And it's like, no, like the layer of policing in prisons is adding violence for all the reasons we've all been talking about. It puts people in cages, it kidnaps people, it deports people. It's, you know, it doesn't do anything to get rid of that. It actually re-traumatizes victims who choose to use that system, all of that stuff. So it's like this idea that it can only be replaced when something, you know, like as if it's doing that, so we need to replace it with something that does it better. It's not doing it. And it gets in the way of actual solutions. And if we just took that money and put it just towards housing and childcare, that would already reduce so much of the stress in people's lives that causes violence inside families, or the kind of neglect that happens to kids, or the just terrible situations that people get put in. So it just, you know, are the reasons so many people get hurt because they're just outside on the street because they don't have housing. Like that is one of the ways that you can be really vulnerable to getting hurt, right? So and not having a safe place to go, or having to go with somebody who you know isn't safe because that's the only place to go, all that stuff. So that is like just a big piece of just like, I really like what you're saying, Jason. It's like, we want to talk about how to build real solutions to all the harms in our lives, of course, because they're real. And we don't need to solve them all before we can get rid of the police in prisons. And that feels like a vital, like getting rid of police in prisons would just take away a bunch of the violence. And then we'd still have to deal with the other violence as we already do, right? Because they don't do anything to help us with that. The thing that the question made me think about with the kind of building love framing was, I remember this moment in my life, I don't know, maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, where Tourmaline said it all came down to isolation. She said that to me. And I was like, yes, like that is the thing. Like when we are isolated, we're so much less safe. And we see that with our friends who are in domestic violence relationships, or how it felt maybe being in your family with family violence. Like we see that isolation is like the most dangerous thing. And the safest thing is when I've got somebody to call, somebody's looking out for me and being like, Dean, that seems weird what you're doing with your boyfriend right now, or that seems strange. That dynamic in your work relationship, I love you and know you enough, I can give you some feedback. I'm worried, you know, and I'm gonna help you if you want it. You know, just like when we actually, or even just when we're on the street, I had an experience of being attacked on a bus, and the bystanders were clearly very disempowered. They wouldn't help me. They acted kind of scared of me, even though they just saw me get attacked. And I was like, oh, they just don't have any skills. They've never talked to somebody on a bus before. They just been looking at their phone, you know, and they haven't talked to anybody on a bus and been like, let me help you with your baby carriage. You know, like just if we could be less alone through breaking that isolation, and that it is aloneness that makes us so unsafe. It's why it makes our elders unsafe during COVID. No one's there to deliver their groceries. Like there's so many different ways being alone makes us unsafe, or nobody knows you're in that jail or in that nursing home who cares and is writing you a letter or checking in on you, right? So I've been thinking about that because one of the things I'm seeing in the defund conversation is people are like, I want a different number to call besides 911. That's, people want all the problems resolved in a similar looking thing. It's like, it's not going to work to have it be like a copy of it, but without cops. Like there's so many reasons why that's not the way. The way is it's not just like, it almost feels like we're being parentified by the state. Like if I just want somebody who's going to come in, who's going to solve things, and we're going to be disempowered, it's actually, we need to empower ourselves to solve problems on our block, to step in when there's a fight happening, and to have the training and support we need. Like I'm not going to do that by myself, but I'm like, oh, the people I keep going out with, we're going to figure out together, what are we going to do if we see a DV situation while we're at the club, or while we're at the meeting, if this is happening, or while we're in the park, you know, like actually skilling us all up instead of being like, we call on some faraway expert to come. Like that is the police model. And I feel like I fear that people also want to replace the police model with that, but it's like a social worker. But we all know sometimes social workers act like cops in our lives. Like this is part of what I see Kenyon referring to with like the kinds of eligibility criteria for, you can only get housing if you take these meds, if you go to these appointments, if you have this budgeting class, like all this bullshit that's in social services, that's the same as prisons. It's why shelters feel like prisons. It's why group homes feel like prisons. And so I'm going on and on, but the two takeaways here are just like, if isolation is the problem, or a central problem leading to so many of our other forms of danger, it's like the solutions and the changes are these deep skilling up and connective cultural shifts where we are empowered to solve problems, not replacing the police with another outside system and handing a blueprint for that to the city and have them be like, stop funding the police and fund this blueprint instead. Like that's what they're asking us for, I think, right now, that the people, you know, that's what we're supposed to be able to deliver. And I think that really misunderstands the abolitionist vision that people have been working on for so long.
You know, I used to be like Kenyon. I often say like my job was to like reduce the harm of the system that's going on right now. And Dean should really hurry up and build that new world because I'm getting very tired doing this thing over here. And in my later life, I guess I've come to the realization that that's actually the job. That's the job, is to build the other world and crowd the cops out. And so, yeah, definitely I'm still thinking about how to reduce the harm in the current system, and also how to address this question that Jason was saying, that if you build the new thing, a lot of what we would think of is criminalized, right? Criminalized through mandatory reporting laws, criminalized through only peace officers can do certain things, intervene in violence, do these things. And so there's ways in which we still have to like protect what we're building. But I definitely, and I remember, you know, I joke about this when like Bell Hooks came out with the book all about love. I was like, oh my God, this like, that's so not, I'm not reading that. That's like, I mean, I'm about serious shit. Like that's, you know, and in fact, that's the answer. Lo and behold, it's actually about love, and it's about love for ourselves and each other, and responsibility for each other. There's a line in the end of the Insight Critical Resistance Statement on Gender-Based Violence in the Prison Industrial Complex. That's something about like creating a world based on mutual accountability and passionate reciprocity. Like it's that not only do I look out for Dean on the bus, but I love Dean, and I'm like, I'm not even gonna let that thing happen to Dean on the bus. Like, and I'm gonna do it, and Dean's gonna do that for me, and we're gonna figure that out together. And I think that one of the greatest issues that we have actually when we're trying to think about police abolition particularly is this question of what is the role of the state. And so the things that Jason and other people bring up is like, and this thing that Kenyon was saying about the cop in your head, like, what is it that makes us think that we can't relate to each other, and that we can't be in conversation and community and accountability and love with each other? Why, if there's an after hours party outside my apartment, say, till 4 a.m, say, outside my bedroom window, say, with some firecrackers going off, and the sun comes up, and I'm like, okay, I love the music, but I have not slept all night. Like, why is there not a way that I'm not already in relationship with my neighbors that we can have a conversation? And I can be like, great music, fantastic. I'm wondering if there's any way we could wrap it up at 3, or if we could just maybe confine it to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then I'll sleep the other nights. Like, or I'll be somewhere else on those days. Like, can we share the space in a way that's about responsibility, not like I'm going to call a non-police responder to come and negotiate with the people who live right next door to me, you know? And people are like, also asking like, well, what about home invasions, right? Well, my neighbor is closer to me and faster, going to respond to me faster in a home invasion, assuming such a thing happens, than a cop who's going to show up late and probably shoot me, because that's what cops do in Breonna Taylor's case or in Tatiana Jefferson's case, right? And so for me, I've come around to the idea that actually my job is to figure out love and love in community, love for each other, and how to manifest this passionate reciprocity. And I really want to pick that up lastly about what Kenyon was saying about our covenant and our contract with Black trans women in this moment. And I want to say that, you know, I'm part of a network of organizations working to end police violence against Black women, queer and trans people. And as part of our project is also to figure out ways to create safety for Black trans women outside of police, because police are clearly a source of violence to Black trans women, but also the ways in which their violence then signals to the rest of the community that violence is acceptable and okay. And I think a lot about another Breonna Hill, who was beaten by police in Kentucky, I think, or maybe it was outside St. Louis, actually. And then a few days later wound up dead. And that's true also of Dewana Johnson. And that's because, you know, the police signal, this is acceptable, this is the way we treat Black trans women, and then communities, that's the risk, then people know. And I think that we all need to particularly be in a covenant and a social contract and a commitment to creating safety for Black trans women within queer communities as the project of abolition, as a central part of the project of abolition. That has to be rooted in love, not tokenism, and in lifting up and celebrating the leadership of Black trans women and creating that safety too. I don't know if you have thoughts, Zahara, on other ways people can be better allies or in that commitment, but I'm not putting pressure on you, I'm just inviting.
Oh no, I thought that was great. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that should be a central part of the work as well.
I'm always inspired when I see Zahara's photos of her and some of the people she works with in Georgia. They're always dressed so nice. They always look like they have such a lovely community, and it's just so inspiring to see the community that you build around your organization, both inside it and outside of it. Super inspiring. And kind of piggybacking on Andrea's comments about like this covenant and how we can be in better community with one another. I'm also thinking about the other LGBT orgs within the greater ecosystem here in HIV organizations. And I just feel like so often they're not focused on the criminal punishment system. We know that most of them are run by white cis men, gay cis men. And it just seems like there's no appetite when I'm screaming like, hey, did you know there are trans women being tortured in solitary confinement right now? And some folks are super responsive, but really people just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to engage in that work. And so I'm wondering if y'all could had advice for organizers on how we can do better to get them at the table, or if you have direct advice for them about why they should be here, or maybe what's stopping them from getting there.
I guess one thing I want to just jump in and say, like, it's so much better now than it used to be. I mean, Kenyon, Dean, and I, and Jason were around during that time when, like, all they wanted was more criminal punishment, and we couldn't get them to talk about policing. And we're all part of creating the working group that is now run by Black and Pink, run by currently and formerly incarcerated queer folks, directing LGBT organizations on what federal policy advocacy needs to look like. You know, when Zahara is like in the leadership of that work, that's what it should look like. And when you're in the leadership of that work, Michael, that's what it should look like. And so I think I want to celebrate the inroads we've made and how we have reminded LGBT organizations of their origins and the fact that they only exist because of resistance of criminalized queers against criminalization. And it feels sometimes hard to remember that, like, we wrote Queer Injustice 10 years ago, and that was kind of a letter to the LGBT movement being like, get it together, you know, and here are people who are getting it together. And we wrote about everyone's work, about Dean's work, about Kenyon's work, about Jason's work, about the work of Black trans women in New York and elsewhere, and about organizing happening in Atlanta and other places. And now it feels like that's kind of, everyone is at that starting point. And it's concerning when the organizations are still run by cis het, or not het obviously, but cis white men who are now speaking on behalf of and capitalizing on the stories of Black trans women without any Black trans women in leadership. And so I think that for me is kind of the next thing, which is, it's not just the issue, it's how you work on the issue and who's working on the issue and the ways in which queers are still criminalized by organizations working on criminalization of queers, right? People decide, just the sex offender issue is one that people don't want to work on. You know, like HIV transmission is also one sometimes people don't want to work on. And then people are like, yeah, non-violent, non-blah, blah. You know, it's like a lot of queers are incarcerated for defending ourselves, or because our lives have made it such that, you know, violence is kind of part of what the conditions under which we're operating. And so I think for me, there's so much, we've come a long way, and there's so much more further to go in terms of lifting up and celebrating and honoring and compensating and centering in a very real way the leadership of currently and formerly incarcerated queer folks and criminalized queer folks who may not have ever gone to prison, but are having to do whatever for a cop every night in order to avoid that. So
I just want to add, I mean, I feel like when I started doing a lot of this work, you know, those orgs didn't have T in their mission statements. They didn't have any trans people working there. They want, their only idea of a criminal justice agenda was get rid of sodomy laws and then add hate crimes laws. Like, it was just like all about how like the cops are going to become the advocates of queer and trans people. And it was opposing planets from the conversation we're having now. And the only thing that changed any of that was, I mean, obviously us all banging our heads against the wall a lot, talking to them, but mainly it was us starting groups that just did that stuff. And then they just were like, oh, that's happening over there. And then they got some of their meaningless reforms passed, and they needed new stuff to do. So they keep getting paid. And so then they added our issues, and they do them in the most like thin, stigmatizing, leave out the most vulnerable people way possible. Because that is how they do it. It's like they, you know, I think for me, it's just clarity that some of those orgs are actually our targets. There's sometimes some really cool people who work in there, of course, and some of us cycle in and out of those and whatever. But those orgs themselves, they are actually one of our targets, just like our city council might be a target, or the DOC in our state might be a target. We move them through escalating pressure through exposing, through competing and showing that this is actually where the issue is. Like, that's the only way it moves, because like those big white gay orgs, they're just like white supremacists like any white nonprofit. I mean, they're just not, there's no reason they would naturally be aligned with like an abolitionist project or an anti-racist project, and their histories show like they're aligned with pro-militarism, with pro-policing, with kind of gay capitalism that's about like white gay upper class people shouldn't have to suffer for being gay, and they should get to have their white picket fence and all that. It's not at all the project that I think we're all talking about, which is like a leftist project of like massive redistribution of wealth, getting rid of prisons and militaries, getting rid of borders. And so when people ask me, I often meet people who are like in their small town struggling with like whatever that version of that white gay org is in their state or in their county or town. And I just say it's this balance. Like, you got to know when you don't have to engage them, because it's like exhausting you and it's a waste of time. And one person's just like tiring you out and tokenizing you. And you got to know when it is strategic. Like, wow, could we get them to sign on to this thing against them building this new prison? What's the likelihood we could? Who else would have to sign on in this town for them to feel like they had to sign on? Like, just pressure, like just as usual, like political pressure. And that pressure sometimes yields some concessions, like, oh wow, they hired a trans person, or oh wow, they like hired a Black person, or whatever. They didn't fire this person they're planning to fire, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to yield them becoming at the center of this much more radical left project. And so we're always going to be in that contested relationship, and it's just about how to have a long-term view on that. And I think there are wins. We have had wins that some of those groups have hired some of the people that we like, and they now do some really great cases for prisoners inside some of those groups, or they sometimes stand with us on something, but then they go around and do something really awful on the issues you'd expect them to, like they align against Palestinian liberation always, or they align, anything that's like too hard for them to look left on, they won't be left on. And so it feels like it's a long-term part of the struggle that is really about recognizing there is a kind of a right-wing gay scene that they're Democrats, but they're to their right, they're pro-military and police, et cetera. And then there's like a left queer and trans thing. And we would be mistaken to think that we're not in actually an oppositional pressure situation.
So for me, I think of how philanthropy is relationship with capitalism and what that looks like, and how many of these nonprofits are relying on funds that are coming from the large corporations and funders who are benefiting from capitalism, and a lot of that is restricted to working to something around criminal punishment because the people who are funding them do not want to do it, and also they're blinded by their privilege. Those who are in the leadership positions are blinded by their own privilege. They cannot and will not understand what it is to be affected by the criminal punishment system, know what it feels like to be a Black person in this world, know what it feels like to be someone that is queer and someone who is trans and someone who is femme. So I think a lot of that happens within those individuals who sit in those leadership positions. They're blinded by their privilege as well.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I don't have much except for clothes. I don't know. I think a lot of those organizations, as my co-panelists and comrades have said, that I don't have a lot of faith in them. I have, over periods of time, worked with individuals within them on, very discrete and specific sorts of things. But to me, I just think even on the basis of, the general sort of equality movement, so you have, same-sex marriage passes, or the Supreme Court makes a decision. And it's, what I find so fascinating is how little it seems like the national orgs were, or the equality orgs were prepared for a blowback and retaliation, which, has actually come fairly fast and fierce. And, so there's been movement to some extent in the sort of cultural space, but like when you also look at, you know, all that like religious freedom sort of bills that got, you know, developed. And I mean, we're still in the midst of that, of kind of fighting those kind of frameworks, which I actually think are broader than just people going after, you know, gay people who want like wedding cake. I actually think the goal is actually to dismantle the Civil Rights Act, right? Because if you can go after the public accommodations for a group, and now that the Supreme Court has made a decision that, at least within the context of healthcare and employment, that, you know, kind of, you know, sexual orientation, gender identity are protected classes, if they continue to advance these cases, you know, at the state level to get to a Supreme Court decision around them, they're really going after the Civil Rights Act. To me, I'm not Dean and Andrea are the legal scholars, but that's what I think. But the ways in which I see that they were just really unprepared for that even has been like astoundingly, you know, terrible. So I don't know what else I would tell them in terms of, you know, what to do at this point, other than, you know, close or rethink your entire thing.
I want to say a brief thing just about stuff happening here in Chicago. There just was this week, a conversation with the superintendent of police who brought together LGBT leaders. It was a very bizarre group of people that I have still no one seems to know yet how they decided who they reached out to. But the information was leaked to other people in addition to those kind of key leaders that whoever the Chicago Police Department decided were our LGBT leaders in Chicago. But what was amazing on this call that included, you know, the Center on Halsted, which has a history, like a super racist history in the city, as well as Howard Brown Health Center, which is a very complicated institution, including, you know, recently firing a nurse, even though they have a union. Anyway, there's a lot of complexities in that, but that gathering of people with the police superintendent consistently said over and over again, our call as LGBT people, predominantly people of color, Black and Indigenous and Latinx folks, is to say, defund the police. We do not want more policing. We're not looking for a better relationship. We're not looking for more LGBT liaisons or whatever. Part of this came out of a cop called someone a faggot when they were arresting them during some of the recent uprisings, as if that was the most horrific thing that could have happened, or as if that's the most homophobic thing that happens, or if that's, you know, the way in which anti-queer, anti-trans violence by police generally looks. I mean, it was terrible. Don't call people a faggot unless you are one, and then do it with love. But don't do that. But that wasn't what people were looking for. What was amazing, though, just truly, things I feel like I was just shocked while listening, and like two people, LGBT orgs saying, no, we are not dealing with this, and maybe, you know, we aren't coming to the table with you anymore. This is like an abusive relationship, right? The police keep coming back and say, you need to come to the table and have conversation with us, or else you're not doing it right, right? And people just resisted and said no, and said, no, you are anti-Black, you are a system that we cannot engage with and will not engage with. And that was powerful.
Thank you. So we have about 4 minutes left, and just wondering if anyone had anything on their spirit that they'd like the audience to know about. Maybe it's something local in your area or a resource for to deepen their learning around abolition.
I just want to just kind of come back to this defund conversation, because I think a lot of queer organizations of the national kind that we're talking about are like, ooh, that's not our thing. Let that be over there, or we're gonna stay out of this. And no, you have to engage, and you need to follow Black leadership on this front, and you need to wrestle with the LGBT movement's relationship with law enforcement in the same way that we're asking the domestic violence, sexual assault movement, or infrastructure or whatever, it's not really a movement, the complex, to wrestle with their relationship with law enforcement, and to not stand on the sidelines and then also privately fight defund in an effort to preserve resources and power and access, right? That at this point, this is a moment, we're in the middle of a triple pandemic. We're in the middle of a pandemic of COVID-19. We're in the middle of a pandemic of anti-Black violence, including lynchings, police violence, white supremacist violence, and we're in the biggest economic crisis of our generation. This is the time to step forward with the boldest and deepest and most visionary demands, because it's what we need to survive this triple pandemic. Like, I actually am not sure how we're going to survive, but if anyone needs to be surviving, it's Black queer folks, and that's going to require the most visionary demands. It's going to require the most visionary and bold and what's sort of seen as risky demands around, like, we need to stop investing in this. We need to stop throwing good money after bad. We have to stop pretending that the system provides any safety for queer people, whether their name is Tony McDade or Brianna Hill or Remy Fells or, you know, any of us, frankly. And so we need to be part of dreaming what the alternative is, and we need to do that under the leadership of people who are most impacted by all the forms of violence that we're contending with in this moment. And so I guess I would say to LGBT organizations, what I'm saying, you know, to anti-violence organizations and other groups is, like, step up, get behind Black leadership, move up, and be accountable and come with us, because we're building a new world, and you can come with us or you can get out of our way or we're going to come for you. So I think that's what I would say in brief.
I just want to say we have a fundraising campaign. Transcending Barriers have a fundraising campaign. We're raising money to purchase land and to purchase a house for housing trans people. Since COVID-19, we've seen an increase in requests for housing, and also understanding that we can't rely on systems where services are being provided. Black trans women are usually the last to be served in these systems, and understanding that we have to be able to continue to make sure that we have the network and all the resources we need to make sure that we can continue to survive, because the system and all these other things will not ensure that for us. So we have a fundraising campaign right now. You can find it at Transcending Barriers. It's on all of our social media handles, Instagram and Facebook, so you can find more information on that.
And we'll also include that in a follow-up email, Zahara, so people don't have to feel scrambled right now. We will get you that website and the donation link.
I'll just do two quick plugs. One, so for organizations that I am currently on the board for, so I'm on the board of NYTAG, New York Transgender Advocacy Group. So I would recommend folks check out nytag.org and all of the good work that our executive director, Kiara St. James, and other folks are doing there. And secondly, I'm also on the board of a new organization called Global Black Gay Men Connect, which is a project to sort of build relationships and do collective, you know, activism and advocacy for Black gay men across the globe. It's a transnational project. And we're doing on July 10th a global Black Pride that will be online. And so each region, so, you know, US and then and the Caribbean, and then Europe and the UK and Sub-Saharan Africa all will have 3 hours apiece of programming that folks can check in. It'll include performances and also discussions within those regions and folks across regions. So check out Global Black Gay Men Connect. I'll drop the link for that, because I think it's going to be fun and a new way to think about how to do work. We're hoping.
Sounds exciting. All right, well, I just want to thank everybody. I especially want to thank Sugani, who was able to lend his voice to this conversation. I want to thank all of these amazing panelists. I've been so nervous this whole time. So thank you for joining. Thank you for providing political education at a time when it feels like it is so critical. And finally, I just want to thank all of our chapter members. Both our formerly incarcerated, our currently incarcerated, and all of our amazing volunteers. So thank you, everybody. And this will be recorded, so that will go out in a future email. And this was also live streamed on Facebook. So if you'd like to view it immediately, you can go on Facebook, visit Black and Pink Boston chapter, and you can view it again or reshare it if you'd like. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing us, Michael, and for such amazing questions. We're so grateful for you and your leadership.
Thank you.
Amen.
Indeed.